Welcome to a grand epic tale of immense power and Mother Nature's unforgiving, absolute wrath. Imagine the greatest empire on Earth, confidently marching to conquer all of Central Europe. In 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent brought his forces to Vienna's gates. Yet this massive force was not ultimately defeated by sharp steel, sheer courage, or brilliant tactics. The ultimate fate of the European continent was decided by relentless, heavy autumn rain. Historical records show the Ottomans had just vanquished the mighty Hungarian kingdom. The Battle of Mohacs left European powers trembling in absolute fear and deep despair. Sultan Suleiman stood at the absolute pinnacle of his glorious military power. His ambitious eyes now turned fiercely toward Vienna, the very heart of the Habsburg realm. Capturing this fortified Christian stronghold would finally tear open the doors to Central Europe. In the late summer of 1529, a massive army of 100,000 marched forth. Vibrant crescent banners fluttered proudly under clear skies as the mighty columns advanced. The elite Janissaries marched in perfect, terrifying discipline, striking fear into the earth. Armed Sipahi cavalry rode magnificent war horses, armor gleaming brightly in the sun. To breach the thick stone walls, they dragged massive siege cannons across the vast and dry plains. The Sultan rode with absolute confidence, wearing a majestic white silk kaftan and turban. He firmly believed no mortal army could ever withstand the crushing weight of his ambition. The Ottoman logistical supply train was an astonishing marvel of 16th century war. Thousands of camels carried endless provisions, gunpowder, and deadly cannonballs to the front. As they crossed the plains, local villages were rapidly swept away by the advancing tide. Christian defenders desperately tried to gather whatever forces they could before the storm. However, modern historians agree the European coalition was dangerously fragmented. They severely lacked the coordinated structure needed to face a fully unified empire. Archduke Ferdinand urgently pleaded for heavy reinforcements from the Holy Roman Emperor. Only a handful of German mercenaries answered the desperate call to defend the city. These battle-scarred veterans wore colorful clothing and carried incredibly heavy halberds. They were highly skilled professionals, but terrifyingly outnumbered by the approaching foe. The city of Vienna hastily reinforced its ancient medieval walls, knowing they were weak. Citizens frantically demolished houses outside the gates to deny the enemy any cover. Every single able-bodied man and woman was quickly drafted into the survival effort. Food supplies were rapidly hoarded, and the city gates were locked tight with heavy iron chains. A deafening silence fell over the Austrian capital as the Ottoman vanguard appeared. The horizon slowly darkened with endless rows of marching soldiers, horses, and siege weapons. From the high church towers, the terrified defenders could see a literal ocean of troops. The sheer psychological terror of facing the Sultan was a weapon as deadly as his guns. Suleiman ordered his men to construct a magnificent tent city that rivaled Vienna's size.
The city will be ours by sunset.
If you stood on those doomed walls, would you have courageously stayed or fled into the night? The stage was perfectly set for one of the most consequential sieges in global history. By late September, a vast sea of Ottoman tents completely surrounded the fortified city. 300 massive cannons were carefully positioned to shatter the ancient stone defenses. Inside the suffocating walls, barely 20,000 defenders prepared to face their dark fate. The harsh contrast in sheer numbers was absolutely staggering, heavily favoring the attackers. Ottoman combat engineers, renowned for their sapping skills, quickly began digging underground. They worked tirelessly under the cover of darkness, swinging heavy pickaxes against rocky soil. Their grim objective was to plant massive barrels of explosive black powder beneath the walls. If these explosive mines were successfully detonated, the entire defense network would fall. The terrified citizens of Vienna could literally hear the muffled digging beneath their feet. Defenders hastily placed bowls of water on the streets to detect subterranean vibrations. Whenever the water rippled, desperate counterminers fiercely dug down to intercept the foe. Brutal, pitch-black skirmishes violently erupted inside these narrow, claustrophobic tunnels. Men perished blindly in the suffocating darkness, using short swords and heavy wooden clubs. Above ground, the deafening roar of artillery constantly battered the crumbling stone walls. The sky was filled with thick, choking smoke and a terrifying rain of heavy iron cannonballs. The German mercenaries fought with fierce courage, unleashing volleys from their arquebuses. When they repelled an attack, another overwhelming wave of elite janissaries charged in. Sultan Suleiman watched the battle from his luxurious tent, completely confident in victory. He knew it was only a matter of time before the exhausted defenders broke under pressure. Food rationing inside the city became increasingly severe, causing panic and deep despair. Tragic casualties piled up in the narrow streets, spreading terrible diseases among the weak. The once proud defenders now looked like living ghosts, their armor rusted, clothing torn to rags. Every passing day felt like an eternity as the relentless enemy bombardment went on. Yet despite the overwhelming numerical superiority, the ancient walls refused to shatter. The Austrian commander brilliantly organized lightning-fast and deadly cavalry sorties. Small bands of desperate knights frequently rode out to sabotage trenches and destroy cannons. These highly dangerous missions bought the dying city a few precious hours of breathing room. According to ancient chronicles, the sheer resilience of the defenders frustrated the Sultan. He ordered his commanders to rapidly increase the pace of the underground explosive mining. The ultimate climax of the siege was rapidly approaching as the massive charges were set. The fate of Western civilization hung precariously by a single, fragile, and thin thread. But the Ottoman war machine had miscalculated one critical, uncontrollable variable. They fought against the heavens as a massive, biblical storm of epic proportions brewed. In early October, the sky violently split open, unleashing a relentless autumn storm. Torrential downpours mercilessly hammered the Ottoman encampment for several dark weeks. The dry plains surrounding Vienna were instantly transformed into a terrifying sea of mud. This sudden, devastating shift in the autumn weather completely paralyzed the mighty army. The heavy siege cannons, their most destructive weapons, became completely trapped in the sludge. Exhausted men desperately tried to pull the massive iron wheels from the swallowing earth. Suleiman was forced to completely abandon his heaviest artillery miles away from the walls. Without these super cannons to shatter the fortifications, the massive siege ground to a halt. The specialized combat sappers now became the Sultan's only remaining hope for a quick win. The brave Ottoman combat engineers dug furiously into the flooded earth beneath the walls. However, the constant torrential rain continuously seeped into the subterranean tunnels. Essential black gunpowder became completely damp and essentially useless for large explosions. The explosive charges failed to detonate under the heavily soaked stone walls. Austrian defenders brilliantly counterattacked inside the collapsed, incredibly muddy trenches. Brutal subterranean warfare effectively neutralized the massive advantage of the enemy. Men violently drowned in the flooded pits while desperately fighting for their very survival. The magnificent Sipahi cavalry struggled helplessly as their war horses sank deeply into mud. Legendary Janissary infantrymen shivered uncontrollably in saturated wool uniforms. The devastating environment actively destroyed the psychological morale of the invaders. Sultan Suleiman watched with extreme frustration as his glorious campaign literally sank. Every single tactical maneuver was thoroughly thwarted by the relentless fury of nature. Disease rapidly spread through the vast, overcrowded encampment as hygiene completely decayed. Thousands of highly trained soldiers tragically perished from severe dysentery and infections. The magnificent logistical supply chain fundamentally broke down due to impassable roads. Food supplies became incredibly scarce, forcing the proud Ottoman warriors to endure hunger. The defenders of Vienna suddenly realized that the merciless weather had become their ally. They furiously patched the broken walls with wet timber and earth while the enemy struggled. A final, massive infantry assault was desperately ordered by the commanders in mid-October. Thousands of screaming Janissaries violently charged through the freezing mud toward the breaches. They were mercilessly decimated by the accurate, concentrated fire of the mercenaries. The agonizing cries of the wounded and dying were completely drowned out by roaring thunder. This catastrophic failure clearly demonstrated that the ancient city would not fall to force. The terrifying reality of the situation finally settled heavily upon the leadership. Suddenly, the relentless rain stopped, only to be immediately replaced by a deadlier threat. The temperature dropped drastically as the first freezing snowflakes of an early winter fell. A terrifying blanket of white snow slowly covered the massive fallen and the frozen mud. The magnificent army of the warm Mediterranean was utterly unprepared for this cold. Thousands of camels tragically froze to death in the pitch-black darkness of the freezing night. Soldiers huddled miserably together for any remaining warmth inside their collapsed tents. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent finally recognized the undeniable truth of the campaign. He could potentially conquer any mortal army, but he could never defeat the heavens. On the 14th of October, 1529, the extremely painful order was given. The incredibly powerful Ottoman Empire would immediately begin a slow, dark retreat.
Get those horses moving through the
Massive stockpiles of heavy equipment and precious baggage were deliberately left behind. The Sultan solemnly turned his magnificent horse around, leaving his greatest dream in the snow. The humiliating withdrawal was an absolute nightmare of freezing conditions and starvation. The retreating columns were constantly harassed by sudden aggressive Austrian ambushes. The legendary Ottoman invincibility was permanently shattered in the frozen mud. Inside the ancient walls of Vienna, the completely exhausted defenders watched them vanish. A profound and overwhelming silence finally descended upon the deeply battered landscape. The church bells of St. Stephen rang out triumphantly across the freezing and desolate field. Men and women fell to their knees in the snow, weeping with absolute relief and gratitude. They had successfully survived the absolute deadliest military threat the world had ever seen. Historians continually debate the incredible significance of this miraculous victory. If Vienna had tragically fallen, the course of Western civilization would be altered. The massive gateway into the very heart of the European continent would have been torn open. Protestant and Catholic nations would have been completely crushed by the advancing forces. But the unstoppable tide of the massive Ottoman expansion reached its geographical limit. Sultan Suleiman would return to the Balkans, but he would never threaten Vienna again. His incredibly glorious reign was permanently scarred by this devastating strategic failure. The Habsburg dynasty successfully secured their essential dominance over Central Europe. They fundamentally transformed the battered city into a magnificent, impregnable fortress. The epic story of the Siege of Vienna remains a powerful testament to human endurance. It vividly illustrates how incredibly fragile the grandest geopolitical ambitions are. A few weeks of severe, heavy rain successfully accomplished what thousands of swords could not do. The impenetrable walls of the capital were ultimately saved by divine intervention. The historic Siege of Vienna clearly proved that even the greatest monarchs bow to nature. Do you think Sultan Suleiman could have conquered Europe if the weather was completely clear? Tell us below. If you truly enjoyed this breathtaking, epic story, please subscribe for more.